edit the video, and then I'll talk as if we just met. I will introduce, just greet everybody, wave everybody, and then I'll give the word to you, Jorge. Okay?
Okay.
So 1, 2, 3. Good morning, everyone. Today we're gathering here for another research seminar for the IAC. Today's speaker is Francesca Calore, and she has been invited by Jorge Martin, who will now briefly introduce her. Jorge.
Okay, first of all, Francesca, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to give a seminar here at the IAC. I only hope that you will be able to visit us physically very soon. Well, you will in December, or maybe for a longer time next year. And let me just introduce you to the rest of the Institute. For those of you that don't know Francesca, Francesca is a very well-known and very renowned scientist in the field of high-energy astrophysics and dark matter. She got her PhD in 2013, jointly between the University of Torino and the University of Hamburg. Then she moved on for a postdoc position to GRAPPA in Amsterdam under the supervision of Gianfranco Bertone, if I'm not mistaken, where she stayed for 3 years. And after that, she landed her permanent job at the CNRS, at the Institute of, to the Laboratory of Theoretical Physics of Annecy Leview in France. And since then, she has been growing as a group, a very strong group on anything related to dark matter, gamma rays, and high energy physics. In fact, she has also been awarded a few times recently due to her, her prominence in the field. In particular, she got the award for the Young Scientist of the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, and also the CNRS Bronze Medal last year, if I'm not mistaken. Now she has a small group with 3 postdocs and 1 PhD student. So without further ado, Francesca, please go ahead, and we are all ears.
Thank you, Jorge, for the invitation. Thank you all for attending. So today I would like to give you an overview of what has been a really mysterious signal in gamma ray data from the Fermi-LAT telescope towards the Galactic Center, which is dubbed the Fermi Gvxs. And I will go through the evidence for the excess and also some perspective to actually unveil its nature. So please feel free to interrupt me at any moment. I go full screen now. Sorry. And if you have questions, otherwise I'm happy to take them at the end of the talk. So this is the outline of my talk. I will give you a very brief overview on how we measure cosmic gamma rays and how we did that in the past. And then I will go ahead giving a brief introduction about what is the composition of the high energy gamma ray sky, especially for the large area telescope in the GeV to TeV range. And the main topic of the talk will be really this Gvxs, how it has been characterized and discovered, what are the implications for dark matter, but also other astrophysical mechanisms that are actually a mystery so far. And finally, we'll provide some outlook on how we can try to unveil its nature with multi-messenger and multi-wavelength probes. So the gamma rays at astrophysical level from the cosmos has been started to discover when satellites were sent on space in the 70s, where we got from this also satellite the first sky map with about 300 of events, so 300 photons coming from the cosmos. And then with following missions, we got a further insight on the nature of those photons, and especially the first discoveries of gamma ray sources like the Crab and Vela pulsars with COS-B. And it was with Egret in the 90s that we finally got a first census of extragalactic and galactic sources, where we could really make some astrophysics and some population studies out of that in an energy range from 30 MeV up to 30 GeV. Since 2008, there is a per-conversion telescope in space, which is the Large Area Telescope aboard the Fermi satellite, which is taking a picture of the sky of a very large field of view and over a very broad energy range, which really has revolutionized our way to see the gamma ray sky at those energies, and has led really an humongous amount of data that has been analyzed in terms of astrophysics and also exotic physics. This is a comparison between the gamma ray maps, all sky gamma ray maps, taken from the precursor of Fermi-LAT, so the Gvxs telescope, and the Fermi-LAT. So this is, just for the context, all sky gamma ray map, where you see the galactic center here at the center of the map, and then the longitude and latitude coordinates that defines the galactic frame. So you can see that the difference between the left and the right is that the image has sharpened a lot. And not only that, you also have collected much more statistics. So the color contrast is a proxy for the number of photons that are detected in each point of the sky. And each point here represents a given line of sight where the telescope was looking at. So, but how are those gamma ray at GeV to TeV energies produced? And this boils down to the astrophysics of cosmic ray sources in the galaxy, and also of astrophysics of extragalactic objects. So there are three main mechanisms that lead to the production of photons in the GeV to TeV domain, which are either of hadronic origin, like the pion decay, or of leptonic origin, like the inverse Compton and the Bremsstrahlung. I will discuss those briefly in a moment. But what is most importantly is that all those photons should come by the acceleration of charged particles, or eventually by the decay or other processes for exotic particles or emission mechanisms. And so really the gamma rays offer a unique way to study those kind of particle accelerations, accelerators in the cosmos. So again, the view of the full sky as seen by almost 10 years of operation of the LAT telescope. And what you can immediately see from this gamma ray map is that there is a very bright emission coming from our galaxy. This is aligned with the galactic disk. And what you see here is what is called the galactic diffuse emission. So the galactic diffuse emission originates from the fact that you have in the galactic disk cosmic ray accelerators, such as supernova remnants or pulsar wind nebulae, that produce and accelerate cosmic ray particles at GeV TeV energies, and those particles are injected in the intergalactic medium, and then they do propagate and feel the effects of the radiation fields and the magnetic fields in the galaxies. And while propagating towards the Earth, then what occurs is that they interact with the environment. And the environment in the galaxy is made by the gas and by the interstellar radiation field. So when you have a cosmic ray proton interacting with a gas proton particle, what occurs is that you have production of gamma rays in the GeV domain, mainly through this pion decay process. And this here on the right is the map of the expected emission from this type of processes, where you see that the gamma ray emission really follows the target material, so the gas density in the galaxy. The same is true for the Bremsstrahlung emission that occurs when an electron injected by cosmic ray sources interact and feel the potential of the protons from the interstellar medium, and then gamma rays are emitted again. And here again is the Bremsstrahlung emission, which traces the target density of the gas. The inverse Compton leads to a bit different, gamma ray expected map. And this process comes whenever you have an electron from the cosmic ray sources that upscatter to GeV energies a low energy ambient photon. Those photons come from what is called the interstellar radiation field that takes contribution from different fields like the CMB, but also the optical light from the stars and the infrared light from the dust emission. So you can have these inverse Compton GeV photons that have a morphology, so a spatial distribution, which is much smoother with respect to those other two processes, and has a very typical signatures. All those three main mechanisms compete to give what is called the galactic diffuse gamma ray emission, which is what I mentioned here, very bright emission from the galactic disk. But what you can see on top of this bright disk emission is that you also spot some bright red points basically all over the sky. Those are identified gamma ray sources. So those are excesses in gamma rays that have been associated with extragalactic or galactic sources through multi-wavelength counterparts. They might be of different origin, and they are typically cataloged in what are called the Fermi source catalogs. This is a procedure that is done regularly, and the latest release of this catalog is with the 8-year data set. Even there is a more recent one with 10 years of data, where the information about the spectral and positional properties of about 5,000 sources are collected. Those sources are reported here. At higher latitude, most of the sources are of extragalactic origin and are active galactic nuclei, which accounts for about 3,000 objects. But the second most abundant population is given by galactic objects here in red stars, if you can see them, which are pulsars and millisecond pulsars. The identification of sources has actually improved very much, about a factor of 5 improvement with respect to the first catalog. And it was not only an improvement in the number of sources, but really in the sensitivity of detection, so the minimal flux that has been detected for point sources, which went down by a factor of 10. Towards the inner galaxy here along the galactic disk at very low latitudes, it's very difficult to identify point sources, and this is because of the bright contamination from the galactic diffuse emission. So it's difficult not only to find an excess which is associated with a point-like source, but also to actually associate it to a multi-wavelength counterpart. And this is indeed along the galactic disk, where the number of sources that do not have counterparts at other wavelengths is the largest. And over the full catalog here, we have about 1,000 sources, so 1/5 of those Fermi-LAT cataloged sources are without any association, and so are still sources whose origin is unknown. The big revolution for Fermi-LAT in terms of galactic sources was really about the contribution of pulsars and millisecond pulsars. Those are highly magnetized rotating compact stars that originate from the collapse of massive stars or the recycling of binaries, and were the first sources identified in the 70s, as I mentioned before, but mainly they have always been identified through radio sources, to radio searches, and they were quite quiet in gamma rays. But it was really thanks to the Fermi-LAT that the number of millisecond pulsars, so pulsars spinning with a millisecond period, increased by a lot, now touching about 2050, almost 300 members, thanks to Fermi-LAT searches. And this is something that really revolutionized our way to look for those mysterious objects. People have then started to make different analyses using really this wealth of data that the LAT is offering us. And one of the things that, of course, people have started to do is to look for exotic physics and to study actually the composition of the gamma ray sky in terms of non-astrophysics. So starting from actually the very early 2010, people have focused in the inner region of the galaxy, which is a very contaminated region by astrophysics, as you can have understood, and have tried to understand what is the composition of the emission coming from those inner few degrees around the galactic center. And by modeling known astrophysical components, as the ones that I mentioned before, people have realized that there were excesses left when residuals were computed. So basically, our knowledge of the astrophysical contribution towards the inner galaxy was incomplete, and an excess was found with a very high significance. And this is what is really the first mention that appeared about the Gvxs. So towards these very inner few degrees around the galactic center, there was this excess emission with a very specific spectral energy distribution. So if you take the flux as a function of energy of the photons that remains in this excess, you can plot what is called the spectrum. And this spectrum is peaked at a few GeV, while its spatial distribution is also very peculiar because it's peaked towards the galactic center with a power law that goes with an index of -2.6, so something very peaked towards the galactic center and almost spherically symmetric. What occurred soon after is that people started to invoke dark matter as a possible way to explain this excess. And one of the proof of the dark matter hypothesis was, of course, to test the presence of this excess emission on larger region of the sky. Because, of course, from a dark matter perspective, you expect a signal from dark matter emission to be broader distributed in space, while normal astrophysics, so standard astrophysical processes, should be confined into the galactic disk. So this is why there were analyses extending the region of interest 20 degrees above and below the plane, and finding this excess emission to be significant even over larger region of the sky. And the characterization of this excess was done by several independent groups at larger latitudes. And what is now quite well established as a rough characterization of the excess properties is the fact that it has an almost uniform spectrum up to 10 degrees. So this means that this peak at 2 GeV in the energy distribution is a peculiar feature that we find in different parts of this excess emission. But let me first go into some details of the gamma ray fitting procedures, because this can help you understanding a bit of the history and the evolution of the excess characterization. So you start with the maps of the gamma ray counts that have been taken by the LAT. And then you have your model that you convolve with the instrument response function. And what you want to do is to characterize the model components in order to get a good fit to these data counts. So, of course, the first challenge to do in this game is to define your model components. This is something you have always to face at the beginning of a fit in not only in gamma rays. So, the template choice is very important because you can define your background model and then eventually add a signal component if the description of your data with the background only hypothesis is not good enough. So in terms of backgrounds, typical backgrounds that have been used, and this is also what I mentioned before, are the backgrounds that come from the galactic diffuse emission, so the inverse Compton, the pi-0, and the Bremsstrahlung, the detected point sources, the Fermi bubbles, which are, again, some mysterious large-scale emission components detected in the gamma-ray sky, whose characterization in terms of spectrum and morphology, however, are quite well defined. So we can use a phenomenological model for the Fermi bubbles to input as a background template in this type of searches, and then an isotropic diffuse backgrounds that account for an overall normalization due to extragalactic physics. So what was found is that these standard astrophysical components were not enough to describe the data, and so a Gvxs signal was included in order to estimate what is the evidence for this additional template. The second challenge is in the fitting technique, so the methodology that is used to fit the gamma-ray sky. So typically you can factorize your model in two terms. One is the morphology, which accounts for the spatial distribution of the photons in your region of interest. And the second part is the spectrum, so the energy distribution of the photons, as I showed some example before. So typically what has been done in the literature, not only for the galactic center, but also for higher latitudes, is what is called the template fitting method, which means that for each component you use a fixed morphology. So you don't allow any freedom in the distribution of photons in space, but what you really leave free to move in your feet, and what you constrain with your feet, is this normalization of the spectrum in each energy bin. So you can basically reconstruct the spectrum of a fixed component, which is template fitting method. And this was done by many authors at the very beginning and by some very recent analysis. It was also explored how you can decompose spectral components in terms of morphology. So this is a completely orthogonal method where you fix the spectrum and you leave the data to reconstruct the morphology of the spectral components that you are testing. So in this case, you have many more free parameters that correspond to your pixels, and you try to see what kind of morphology emerges associated to a given spectrum. And this was tested by a few groups, always finding evidence for an excess emission. And finally, what we have developed in 2017 with Christoph Wenninger and Emma Storm was a new method where you have an hybrid approach between those two techniques, where you leave both the freedom in the morphology and in the spectrum. But of course, you cannot leave everything free, because otherwise your fit will never converge. So you have to apply some kind of constrained likelihood in order to have some mitigation and regularization of your nuisance parameters. And so this is kind of advanced fitting techniques where you can account on the uncertainty on the morphology, as well as reconstructing the bin by bin spectral energy distribution. So the evidence for the excess emission with all those different techniques is now well established. This is the excess is there. The rough characterization, as I mentioned before, is also something that is common to most of the analysis. What has been proven to be very powerful in reconstructing the gamma ray excess properties were techniques that managed to beat the systematic uncertainty due to the galactic diffuse emission. And this means that in this kind of, no matter what technique you use, only techniques and implementation of those techniques that managed to reduce significantly the residuals left after the fit were successful in characterizing the gamma ray excess. And this means that what it means is that typically for template fitting techniques which do not use optimized galactic diffuse models, what occurs is that residuals are still at the level of 30–40% in the region around the galactic center, which means that you can easily have over or under subtractions that bias the reconstruction of the galactic center excess properties. While either with a better work on the gas maps, as I will show afterwards, or this type of new implementation of SkyFact, people arrived to get residuals of the order of 10%, which is yet not optimal, but much better than what was done before. So let me spend a few minutes about the Gvxs morphology, because this is something that has been revamped in the recent literature, and there are a few points that are very important for me to make. So the Gvxs morphology historically is related to what is the template for the Gvxs that you put in. So historically, what has been tested is a spherically symmetric profile inspired by dark matter annihilation template. And this, you can see it here. What you can do is to reconstruct the emissivity, so the flux surface brightness, as a function of angular distance from the galactic center. And you can do that in different ways. If you do averages over spherical shells, what you are assuming implicitly is that you are looking for something which is spherically symmetric, and you will have something that follows this black line here. So only if you test asymmetries in your template, like by dividing in different sectors or testing different type of morphologies in your analysis, then you are sensitive to variations in the spherical symmetry. And from the point of view of models, so what is predicted by different theory is that if for dark matter annihilation, in most of the cases, you will have something which is by construction spherically symmetric. This is not the case for some astrophysically inspired models. And in particular, what was done in around 2018 was to go beyond dark matter templates when choosing the Gvxs signal to put in your analysis. And in particular, people have started to investigate how using a template that traces the stars in the stellar bulge affects the reconstruction of the galactic center excess. So what we have in our own galaxy is that at the galactic center, the baryonic potential is dominated by this galactic bulge, which in different models is what is called a boxy bulge, which has a typically oblate shape, with in the very inner region a very dense cluster of stars, which is called the nuclear bulge. There can be other structures related to the bar, for example, or with what is called this X-shaped bulge that has been seen in infrared data. So what you can do is to build templates for the bulge emission that trace the density of stars, and then use those bulge-shaped templates to do your gamma ray analysis. So this was done by two independent groups. So one was the group in Amsterdam, where I worked, and I contributed to, and the other group was the group by Ronan Crocker and Oscar Macias. So those two groups independently, they tested different bulge morphologies and compared them to dark matter inspired templates. And what was found by both groups is that there is a strong evidence for this additional stellar bulge model and no evidence for an additional dark matter model. And that really the preference of the data from this kind of morphology is driven by an asymmetry that seems to be preferred in the data that makes the Gvxs to be more oblate than what was found before. And the crucial elements in this game to find this kind of bulge evidence were, for the Amsterdam group, the fact of beating the residuals due to the galactic diffuse emission thanks to this new fitting method that accounted for those freedom in space. And for the other group was instead an optimization of the diffuse model with a huge work on the gas maps. So now that I told you about the characterization of the excess and the latest development, please let me go through what is the origin of this excess, because its characterization really doesn't tell us much about what its origin is. So the possible interpretation fall under two broad categories, where ones are truly diffuse processes, like the emission from dark matter, and the other are unresolved point sources. The constraints that, no matter what interpretation has to match, are on the one hand the good fit, to provide a good fit to the spectrum and the morphology of the excess, and on the other hand, eventually, they can be cross-checked with emission in other wavelengths. So the first interpretation that was brought up and also led to a lot of enthusiasm in the community was really the dark matter interpretation. So the dark matter is the dominant component of the matter in the universe, that can, in most of the models, be explained by new particles beyond the standard model of particle physics. And in this case, you can have thermal candidates that do produce final state particles and final photons. And so we do expect dark matter in the galaxy to shine in gamma rays if the mass of this particle and the annihilation cross-section are in the right range to give final GeV photons. So in terms of dark matter, different channels for annihilation do well fit the galactic center excess spectrum. So the intensity can be explained by dark matter annihilation with a mass of about 50 GeV if we are talking about annihilation into quarks, but also heavier annihilation into heavier boson can work, given the systematic uncertainties in the spectral reconstruction. And most of all, what it was really striking at the beginning was that this surface brightness as a function of angular distance for the galactic center of the galactic center excess at higher latitudes, but also in the inner part of the galaxy, was really well fitted by expectation for the dark matter angular distribution in the galaxy as expected from typical simulations. Was soon after realized that not only dark matter can account for this excess emission in the galactic center, but also other processes. In terms of diffuse processes, what people have tried to do was to have an additional population of cosmic rays in the galactic center, so either protons or leptons. Those would then undergo the interaction with the gas and the interstellar radiation field in the galactic center and produce diffuse radiation as the ones that I mentioned before from inverse Compton and pion decay. And let me mention that this type of cosmic rays, population of cosmic rays in the galactic center were not included in the model for the galactic diffuse emission that are typically used to derive the background for the excess analysis. So you can have cosmic rays that are injected in the central molecular zone in a continuous way, so steady state injection, and those kind of models have some trouble in fully accounting for the spectral shape of the excess, but still this kind of emission is something that can contribute to a few % of the excess emission. And what was also tested was the possibility to have some time-dependent injection of cosmic rays related to the outburst activity of the galactic center in terms of star formation, as also attested by the existence of the Fermi bubbles. And this kind of model, in this kind of model, you need at least 2 bursts of cosmic ray injection in the past in order to account for this very extended emission, because the leptons that are injected cools very, very fast. And so you can, with only one burst, you cannot account for both the spectrum in the inner galaxy, so in the very inner few degrees, as well as the spectrum at high latitudes. So you need at least 2 bursts, one younger that accounts for the emission in the inner region of the excess, and then one older one that had more time to cool, and so pushed the electrons farther away from the galactic center. So both scenarios, although possible, have some difficulties in terms of the part of the parameter space for which they can work on. They seem a bit fine-tuned. So the second class of processes is instead related to what are called unresolved point sources. So as I mentioned before, we have a plethora of point sources that are detected and associated, like star-forming galaxies, IGN, pulsar, and supernova remnant. But then we also have a lot of them that are not non-associated, and what we do expect is that a large fraction of those sources actually are too faint to be detected by the LAT. So if you have a full population of sources, what occurs is that you typically have a detection threshold of the LAT, just schematically here, this black dashed line. And above this threshold or right below threshold, you can classify the source as detected, but the luminosity distribution of sources is not cut at the threshold of your telescope, of course, but keep going down at lower luminosities. And so you have a large fraction of no matter what population that is unresolved. And these unresolved sources anyhow emit gamma rays, and therefore the cumulative emission from the population of subthreshold sources can still give a substantial diffuse emission in gamma rays and can contribute to the diffuse emission in the galactic center, but this is something that has been studied also at higher latitudes. In terms of unresolved sources, what are the sources that can really explain the galactic center excess, spectrum, and morphology? There are not many, because of the specific spectral shape of the galactic center excess. So the fact that this is quite robustly assessed, that the spectrum of the Gvxs peak at 2 to 3 GeV, there are not many astrophysical sources that can have this spectrum, and the only ones that do have so, and are pretty degenerate with it, are pulsars and millisecond pulsars, which have indeed a spectrum which is cut at a few GeV. So in terms of the spectrum, they can do a good job. And then the question has been for a long time, what about the morphology? Can a population of pulsars or millisecond pulsar have a spatial distribution that can account for this very extended emission related to somehow the galactic bulge? So before the evidence for the stellar bulge emission and the better fit of stellar bulge templates with respect to dark matter templates, the discussion was really if you can form a spherically symmetric distribution of pulsars and millisecond pulsars. So young pulsars have been soon left aside because it's very difficult to explain such a high extension of young pulsars, which should really be formed in the galactic disk. However, for millisecond pulsars, the story is a bit different because those form from binary interactions, and there are scenarios that now can explain the formation of millisecond pulsars in the galactic bulge through different scenarios like the tidal disruption of globular clusters that had an infall towards the galactic center, or from channels of formations which are not the typical recycling channel, but rather are, as an example, the accretion-induced collapse from oxygen-neon white dwarf stars. However, the fact that the evidence of the stellar bulge distribution was so striking with those very recent analyses has led people to really support the hypothesis of stars, of something related to stars, to be responsible for the Gvxs. Another way to support the point source emission versus purely diffuse emission has been an advance in, again, methods to analyze the gamma ray sky. So what you can do besides this very large region of interest fits that I mentioned till now is to focus on the statistics of the photon counts. So here are two different photon maps, counts maps. One is for a signal which is truly diffuse, like, for example, from dark matter annihilation, and the right one is a signal that arises from a population of unresolved point sources. So you can see just by eye, by comparing those two maps, that there is a difference in the way in which photon counts cluster in this map. And people have developed statistical methods to quantify those differences and use that for model comparison between those two kinds of emission. This was done in two independent ways. One was through a wavelet transform of the gamma ray sky by looking for peaks in gamma ray data after you have convolved with a kernel, a wavelet kernel, and it was found by Bartels and collaborators that there was evidence for unresolved point source population in the galactic center through this wavelet algorithm. And the second independent method that was developed is through what is called Non-Poissonian template fitting. This exploits the differences that are in the photon statistics between a smooth signal and a point source distribution, which is non-Poissonian distributed but has long tails. And also this group found evidence for unresolved point sources rather than a diffuse signal from dark matter. However, things are always more complicated, because then in the more recent past, people have tried to rerun those analyses, and there were claims of dark matter striking back at the galactic center, which boils down to the fact that there were systematic uncertainties that were not explored in those previous 2016 works, but emerged in those more recent results. So the wavelet was reapplied to a latest data set with a new version of the catalog, and you can see here the number of peaks as a function of significance, of energy range. And while for the 3FGL, that was the one used in the 2016 analysis, you can clearly see that there is an excess of wavelet peaks, which may be associated with really subthreshold point sources. This is not the case any longer for the 4FGL. And so by this analysis in 2020, it was claimed that the bulk of the excess cannot be really explained by subthreshold point sources. And the same occurred basically from non-Poissonian template fitting, where the same, part of the authors of the original paper had different works back and forth by analyzing really in a more systematic way the effect of inducing a mismodeling due to using, first of all, a non-optimized galactic diffuse emission model for the analysis that was performed in 2016, and also kind of better models for the signal. So then there was a third player in this story, because the statistics of the photon counts can be also analyzed with what is called the one-point probability distribution function. This was a method that was developed in the early 2010s and even earlier than gamma rays was adapted to radio and X-ray data. And it boils down in fitting what is called this pixel count distribution. So this is the number of pixels as a function of counts per pixel that you have in a map. And you can see that different gamma ray components, so the galactic diffuse emission here in red, the point sources here in blue, or the isotropic component, have a different distribution in this parameter space. So what people have done was to implement fit of this distribution and try to disentangle the high counts pixel tail that would come from point sources. This method was thoroughly tested on Fermi-LAT data at high latitudes, and it was used actually to measure point sources below the Fermi-LAT catalogs. So these are the sources that are in the Fermi-LAT catalogs, and those are the point sources that instead are reconstructed by this kind of method. So they can push the sensitivity of the LAT to lower fluxes. So this is the number of sources as a function of flux, and to get a better sensitivity on subthreshold point sources. So what we have done with Silvia Manconi and Fiorenza Donato the past year was to combine two methods in a new approach. So we use this adaptive template fit to obtain an optimized model for the galactic diffuse emission, and so overcoming all those systematic uncertainties that the Non-Poissonian template fit community has actually brought up, and combining it with the photon count statistics. So using the fit to the one-point PDF distribution to try to answer those two questions. So is a fraction of the galactic center excess due to unresolved point sources, and is the morphology of the excess compatible with a bulge-like or a dark matter-like emission when unresolved point sources are included in the fit. And what we managed to do is that in the inner galaxy, we got a very robust assessment of the number of sources per unit flux as a function of flux. So this is source count distribution for all the point sources in the region of interest, where here the black and gray points are the sources that are in the Fermi-LAT catalog, and here the blue and red curves is the reconstruction of this source count that we made with the new analysis. So you can see that while the 4 FGL sources basically are limited to be detected above a few in 10 to the minus 10 photon per centimeter square second, with this new implementation of the one-point PDF with the optimized diffuse model, we went down to a few in 10 to the minus 11. So showing that there is evidence for subthreshold point sources in the inner galaxy. And this is the same, to the same conclusion arrived also other people with completely independent method, either the Non-Poissonian template or new implementation related that relies on machine learning, on convolutional neural network and simulation-based inference. When it comes to compare these combined one-point PDF with optimized galactic diffuse emission models, with between boxy bulge and dark matter template, then again, even in the case we model unresolved point sources, there is a preference for the stellar bulge morphology rather than the dark matter morphology. So this kind of analysis, together with those machine learning, very recent one, confirms that there is an at least partial stellar origin of the Gvxs. And what is the fraction of gamma rays that are due to point sources, and what is the fraction of gamma rays that comes from truly diffuse processes? This is still really an open question. There were, with those two machine learning papers, some attempt and quantification that at least 40% of the excess emission is due to point sources, but it really is a matter of ongoing study. So to conclude, in the few minutes that I've left, I would like to give some prospect about how we can really probe the Gvxs point-like source nature, because this is really something on which we can leverage with multi-wavelength data. So the Gvxs, if this is due to point sources, implies that there is a large population of point sources, most likely millisecond pulsars, that sit in the galactic bulge. But those millisecond pulsars are not blind and are not completely only emitting gamma rays. They are also emitting in other wavelengths, because we do see millisecond pulsars in radio, we do see millisecond pulsars in X-rays, and we hope to see millisecond pulsars in gravitational waves. So how we can really exploit this multi-wavelength and multi-messenger emission from those kind of sources. So the first obvious thing to do, and probably the most promising one on a short time scale, is to use large radius surveys to look for this hidden population of sources towards the galactic center. There are many other reasons for which radio astronomers look for pulsars and millisecond pulsars in particular towards the galactic center, which are unrelated to the galactic center excess. But this makes our science case very appealing for them. And a collaboration is ongoing in the MeerKAT-TRAPPUM collaboration, which is a large survey project of MeerKAT to really look for pulsars. And MeerKAT is a large radio telescope array, which is the precursor of the square kilometer array. And there are ongoing searches for pulsars in different targets, but especially towards the galactic center. And we have very good prospects to see this bulge radio population with MeerKAT. So in 2016, I ran some sensitivity prediction of this population in radio. So I simulated the population of bulge pulsars in the galactic bulge, those blue points here, the black points here, and also the foreground that comes from the disk population of pulsars, the one that we locally can measure. And we have shown that you can have a very good sensitivity with MeerKAT with 100 of detection at most, if you get about 100 hours of observation. And this can really establish the presence of millisecond pulsar in the bulge and solve part of the debate about its nature. But you can also go further and look at other wavelengths. So together with Joanna Berthaud, who is a PhD student with me in LAPTh, we have investigated if in X-ray, so with current X-ray telescopes, you would be sensitive to this bulge population, and even more so if current catalogs of X-ray telescope like Chandra exclude or not exclude this kind of hypothesis. And what we have found is that the current Chandra catalog does not exclude the possibility to have a population of bulge MSP in the galactic bulge. And we push that even further. We have selected a sample of 300 sources that match synthetic MSP properties, and we have reduced this sample to about 150 promising candidates that we want to follow up in radio, and some of those follow-ups are already ongoing at Parkes and the Nancy radio telescopes, so this will hopefully give some results very soon. And on the longer time scale, then what you also have is some serendipitous implications for gravitational waves. Indeed, neutron stars, because of the fact that are highly rotating bodies, if they have a slight ellipticity, so a slight small deviation from spherical symmetry, they can be sources of quadrupolar emission of gravitational wave. And this is something that people look for. So there are targeted searches towards known close-by pulsars to set constraints on this gravitational wave emission, which is related really to the formation and the equation of state of the neutron star. And what we came up in 2019 with Pasquale Serpi, and Henri Gimbaud was a work where we derived what is the sensitivity of third-generation instruments like Einstein telescope to a stochastic gravitational wave background induced by this large population of MSP in the galactic bulge, finding that this should be the dominant contribution to the stochastic gravitational wave background in the galaxy, and it has also some specific anisotropy that can be looked for. So even if this is on a very long time scale, the gravitational wave can offer a crucial diagnostic for the galactic center excess nature. So let me conclude with a mention again to the dark matter interpretation, because if this is dark matter, really, there should be a consistent signal elsewhere, right? So other messengers and searches in gamma rays towards other targets should compete and give a coherent picture with the interpretation of the galactic center excess in terms of dark matter. So this is a typical exclusion plot of the annihilation cross-section as a function of dark matter mass that probably some of you have seen many times, where we can plot for different targets and different type of searches the exclusion bounds that we have. So anything above the lines that you see here is excluded by this specific search, but also eventual some signal. So here is the blob that would be associated to a dark matter interpretation of the Gvxs. And with gamma rays, the strongest constraints come from the search for dark matter in dwarf spheroidal galaxies with the LAT. No excess was found till now, so strong constraints can be set, which tantalize the interpretation of the excess in terms of dark matter. But also a complementary constraint comes from antiprotons, where there was evidence for a signal starting from 2015 that now seems to be not significant in most of the recent analyses that have been performed. And also antiproton can really provide a strong constraint on this type of interpretation. And very recently was put out a work by the EMU survey with ASCAP, so a radio telescope in Australia, looking and pointing at the Large Magellanic Cloud and getting very strong constraint on the GeV thermal dark matter, which would exclude completely the dark matter interpretation of the Gvxs. So I come to my conclusions, and I hope I managed to give you an overview of the history of the galactic center excess and its characterization, which really boils down to what we can do with Fermi-LAT data and what people have worked out to try to understand the high energy gamma ray emission of this very excellent instrument. So the nature of the Gvxs remains currently a mystery. There are several ways to look for possible interpretations, and a way to exclude or find evidence of this unresolved point source population is really to go for multi-messenger and multi-wavelength searches and currently there are people that do that, and so stay tuned for future results. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Francesca. Thanks a lot for this very, very interesting talk. So now it's, as Francesca said, time for questions. We don't have much time. So please, anyone, feel free now to, so Jorge is the first one actually raising his hand, but I can only see Jorge's hand. So Jorge, why don't you go ahead, unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Francesca, for the very nice talk. So as far as I understand, so basically, the dark matter interpretation seems to be very much not very much supported by the data, no, and on the whole analysis you have done, no, especially the last slide is very disappointing, no, the other constraints from looking at dwarf galaxies and this large Magellanic cloud, yeah. So yeah, so what is your thoughts about that? I mean, do you think it's now very not very compelling, the dark matter story here, or?
Yeah, this is my main takeaway of the story. Even if we don't trust the Fermi-LAT, so even if one is maybe skeptical about analysis that found evidence for the bulge, or this old story about statistics of photon counts is confusing. To me, really one killing point for the dark matter interpretation is the fact that constraints from other targets start to be very, very compelling. And especially this radio one, which to my understanding is quite robust, but okay, it might turn out that it's not, but to the best of my knowledge, it is. So it's very hard to push this kind of line above this Gvxs blob. Becomes difficult to justify the galactic excess interpretation, although perhaps one can come up with some model for which towards the inner galaxy, I don't know, either the shape of the large Magellanic cloud profile, dark matter profile is completely odd, which is probably not.
And another related question, if I may, very quickly. So if it is dark matter, I mean, you showed that you can get quite well the distribution of the profile and the morphology, right? I mean, it's part of what you showed. I mean, and in principle, it seems to be very Caspi, no? I mean, in the sense, I think it fits very well on our Frank White profile, right? So I wonder if this has been put in connection to this core cusp or a small scale structure problems before, if it is dark matter.
So as I said, let me just here. So there are 2 points, right? So I think what we can say is that it really is Caspi on a scale of a few percent of degree in the inner galaxy, but of course we are limited by the angular resolution of the instrument. So it excludes cores that are larger than 1 degree, that's for sure, but can still allow for much smaller cores. So I've never seen, to the best of my knowledge, a discussion of what is the maximal length of a possible core allowed by this type of analysis. So it might be interesting to try to quantify it. And yet it is clear that a strong cusp is preferred by the data. And this is by all means the fact that, for example, also when you have a bulge profile, you really need the contribution from the nuclear bulge, so this very inner density, in order to account for this rising of the Gvxs data spectral points.
Thank you.
Francesca, on this same plot, sorry, there's a question by Mark. Mark, just because we're right now on the right spot, and I wanted to ask Francesca about this. Really wanted, you have in red shaded regions, you're showing that your own data, you're having some evidence for this excess at such high distances, large distances from the galactic center.
Yes, this is. Let me just go back here. So this is in this 2015 analysis, but hasn't really changed. So what you can do is to dissect the region that you analyze in different sectors and plot the spectral distribution of these of the photons in excess in each of these regions, and you find that the signal is of course significant in the innermost region. Then the significance decreases if you just analyze one very small patch, but you still have an emission at the same level of intensity at here we are at tenths of degrees.
Right.
So yeah.
But do you have bulge? You have stellar bulge at such large distances, or can you discard that this signal is actually caused by the bulge?
You also have the bulge at such large distances. If you look just at the model prediction, this is again the surface brightness as a function of radius, and this gray here shaded area is the bulge. So you still have significant bulge emission, and let me just show here. So I can zoom in. Can you see the zoom?
Yes, of course.
So those lines, color lines, are not very great, but this dark green line here is the bulge, is the boxy bulge, and this black here is the dark matter. So you see they have different shapes, and this is what can disentangle the two, but they extend up to 15 degrees in
right. So this connects, actually, this plot connects to the question I wanted to ask you is, and this is, you are hammering the center of the galaxy, because I guess that the signal goes to the density of the dark matter squared. So is it out of the question to actually try to look for cleaner regions in the galaxy that are cleaner from stars, which could have some signal from dark matter? They are not too high latitude, so you would expect some signal that is not too low, and you could stack all those patches of Fermi-LAT, but having regions that are clean from stars, clean from optical counterparts. Has anyone thought about that?
There are searches for dark matter at high latitudes. So let me just zoom back. So what people usually do is to cut the galactic plane and search for large-scale diffuse signal here and here. Now you are talking about, let's for example do circles. Right. In regions that are far away from the bulge, but perhaps still in a region where the dark matter is not so much suppressed. I think there was a Fermi-LAT paper doing that in 2015, 2016, but it's true that it's not something that people do frequently. So I only remember this paper not finding any evidence and setting constraints. But it might be interesting to look again at this type of optimization of the region of interest away from the bulge.
I have a bunch of more questions, but I'll let Mark ask his own question. Mark was writing here in the chat that thank you very much for this very nice talk. Could you please provide more details about the deep learning simulation-based inference constraints?
Okay, so it's not my expertise, so let me just take the backup slide and tell you to the best of my knowledge what I can say. So what were they doing in this work of 2021? They have used convolutional neural networks to train their machine in order to try to disentangle. So let me just zoom on it. In order to try to disentangle those two different luminosity functions for the galactic sources or the dark matter, basically. And what they have I think they fitted for was this histogram of number of sources as a function of intensity for different components. And And what they have found is that, as I mentioned before, is that there is at least 40% of the excess emission, which is in their work attributed to faint sources. Then I don't know the detail of the implementation. I also one mention here is that in order to beat those systematic uncertainties coming from the galactic diffuse emission mismodeling, they use Gaussian processes in order to overcome the uncertainties due to the fixed gas maps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, more questions from Francesca. For Francesca, I see no raised hands. If not, may I ask the very last one? If you go to slide 44.
44. This one?
Yes, then the radio apparently kills everything. I was wondering, how does the radio kill everything? I mean, in the sense that, how can you constrain that matter with radio?
Yes, so physically what occurs is that you have, again, is the same mechanism. So you have two dark matter particles that annihilate. So they form, no matter what's in the interaction in between, they form final state particles like quarks or bosons or leptons. And those then decay and hadronize, forming gamma rays. So at different wavelengths. So what occurs here, I think in this specific, in radio, is that you have, for this line here, is that you have annihilation of dark matter into big quarks. This should be the big quark constraint. And those big quarks produce electrons and positrons besides gamma rays. So you also have a contribution from the synchrotron emission of these electron and positrons that falls in the radio band. Okay, but then could you have other dark matter types that decay not in these big quarks, giving rise to these electron-positron pairs? Sure. I think for the radio, now that I'm thinking twice about that, you can build some model for which you have only gamma rays and you suppress the electrons. But then you have to go into model-dependent constraints, which typically is not what we do in direct detection. But I think you can evade those kind of constraints if you do some more model-dependent analysis. I see. But anyway, even if we ignore the radio, circle, yeah, we have. Yeah, and now I haven't presented here. So I have presented this antiproton limit here with a data set that is the one used to derive this antiproton excess. And indeed, you see here that there is the limits weaken slightly because of this is like 1.3 global significant excess, but still the limits weaken. But there is a latest release of the IMS antiproton data, which was presented in both works. So this Di Mauro 2021 and one of my work here, where the limits here basically are much stronger and there is no evidence any longer. I mean, this also 1.3 excess is completely washed away. I see. So for the moment, even if you don't trust the radio, you got quite stringent constraints from antiprotons. I understand that the red circle is the 2 giga. What is giga? Yes, this is the galactic center excess best region for annihilation into big quarks. I see. All right. Thank you again, Francesca. Last chance for asking questions. Jorge, you're like jumping on the screen. Do you want to say something or?
No. It's perfect, beautiful talk, Francesca. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesca.
Thank you for the invitation. It was very nice too.
All right. So
I always like very much to talk about the Gvxs. So.
All right. Thank you again. So let me say bye to everyone. And here I will stop the YouTube transmission. Bye-bye.
Bye.